On the morning of September 8, 1380, a young prince stood at the edge of the Don River and looked south toward an army that had terrified the Russian lands for generations. Across the mist-covered field, the banners of the Golden Horde snapped in the cold wind, and beneath them waited a force built on conquest, speed, and fear. For nearly a century and a half, princes had bowed, cities had paid tribute, and entire populations had lived under the shadow of Mongol power. That was the world Dmitry Ivanovich had inherited. But on this morning he was no longer willing to accept it. Behind him stood men from Moscow, Vladimir, Suzdal, Rostov, and other Russian lands, drawn together by something larger than loyalty to one ruler. They had come to the Don carrying old fears, private grief, and the memory of generations taught that resistance was hopeless. In front of them stood Mamai's army, vast and battle-hardened, representing not just one warlord, but the weight of an empire that had broken kingdoms and humbled princes from the steppe to the forests of the north. Between the two armies lay more than open ground. There was a decision about what kind of future would follow. This was not simply a contest for territory, and it was not just another medieval battle fought over pride or tribute. It was a moment when submission was tested against courage, when a fractured people had to decide whether they were still subjects of fear or whether they were ready to fight for something of their own. On the field of Kulikovo, the stakes were nothing less than civilizational. If Dmitry failed, the old order would tighten its grip. If he held, even for a single day, the impossible might begin to feel real. Here, on this quiet field by the Don, an empire's hold began to crack, and a nation began to imagine itself differently. For nearly 150 years before the Battle of Kulikovo, the Russian lands had lived under a system of domination that shaped every prince, every city, and every political decision. It began in the 13th century, when the Mongol invasion crashed into Eastern Europe with overwhelming force. Cities that had once stood as proud centers of trade, worship, and regional power were burned, looted, and reduced to ruin. Ryazan was destroyed. Vladimir was devastated. Kiev, once one of the great cities of the region, was left broken. What survived was not a united country, but a patchwork of weakened principalities forced to live in the shadow of a new power, the Golden Horde. The Horde did not need to occupy every town or station soldiers in every village to control the Russian lands. Its genius was political as much as military. Russian princes were allowed to remain on their thrones, but only if they accepted the authority of the Khan. They paid tribute, delivered loyalty, and traveled to the Horde's court to receive formal recognition of their right to rule. Power no longer rested on bloodline alone, or even on local support. A prince could govern only so long as the Horde allowed it. That arrangement created a culture of submission, but it also created competition. Princes maneuvered against one another for favor, trying to gain advantage through obedience, wealth, and careful diplomacy. Resistance was possible in theory, but in practice it was usually suicide. The memory of what happened to those who defied Mongol authority was too brutal and too fresh. But empires rarely remain as strong as they appear at their peak. By the second half of the 14th century, cracks had begun to spread through the Golden Horde. Internal rivalries weakened central authority. Competing factions struggled for control. Civil conflict drained energy and shattered the sense of inevitability that had once made the Horde seem untouchable. This did not mean the Horde had become harmless. It was still dangerous, still capable of assembling large armies and punishing defiance. But it was no longer the perfectly unified force that had once imposed terror from the steppe to the forests. For the first time in generations, ambitious men in the Russian lands could begin to imagine that Mongol power might be challenged. No city recognized that opportunity more clearly than Moscow. It had not always been the most important of the Russian principalities. It was neither the oldest nor the most prestigious. Yet Moscow had something even more valuable: strategic patience. Its princes had learned how to survive under Mongol domination and even benefit from it. They collected tribute, built political alliances, expanded their influence, and steadily increased their strength while rivals weakened. Over time, Moscow became more than just another principality. It became the center of a growing idea that leadership among the Russian lands might one day be consolidated there. At the center of that transformation stood Dmitry Ivanovich. He was young, but he was not reckless in the childish sense. What made him dangerous was that he understood timing. He could see that the horde was divided, that Moscow was stronger than it had ever been, and that there are moments in history when refusing to act carries greater risk than confrontation. So he did what generations before him had avoided. He refused submission. He withheld tribute, rejected the demands of Mamai, and began gathering support for open resistance. That decision turned him from a regional prince into the central figure in a much larger story. By the time the armies moved toward Kulikovo, this was no longer just about Moscow's survival. It was about whether the old order of fear would continue, or whether the Russian lands had finally found a leader willing to test it. By the late summer of 1380, the crisis that had been building for months could no longer be delayed or negotiated away. Mamai was coming north with the kind of army meant not merely to punish, but to erase resistance before it could inspire others. His goal was brutally simple: break Moscow, destroy Dmitry Ivanovich's credibility, and remind every prince in the Russian lands that defiance against the Golden Horde would always end the same way. Mamai understood power not just as military strength, but as reputation. If he crushed Moscow in open fashion, the political lesson would travel faster than any cavalry rider. Fear would be restored, tribute would resume, and the old order would survive. Dmitry understood that just as clearly. If he waited behind the walls of Moscow, he might preserve his life for a little longer, but he would lose the initiative and likely the city itself. A siege or a direct assault on Moscow would hand Mamai the kind of symbolic victory he needed. So Dmitry made the hardest choice a leader can make. He decided not to absorb the blow, but to step forward and meet it. He sent calls across the Russian lands, summoning princes, retainers, cavalry, militia, and every fighting man willing to stand with him. Not everyone answered. Some hesitated, calculating the odds. Some feared Mongol retaliation more than they trusted Moscow's ambition. But enough came. Men arrived from Moscow, Vladimir, Suzdal, Rostov, Yaroslavl, and other principalities, gathering into what was likely the largest Russian force assembled in living memory. Whatever their private rivalries, they now faced a threat too large to ignore. Before marching south, Dmitry sought something more than manpower. He sought moral authority. He traveled to the Trinity Monastery to receive the blessing of Sergius of Radenez, one of the most revered spiritual figures in the Russian world. In moments like this, medieval politics and religion were never truly separate. A military campaign needed more than logistics and steel. It needed meaning. Sergius gave Dmitry that meaning. His blessing transformed the march from a political gamble into something closer to a sacred cause. Later tradition would remember that he even sent warrior monks to ride with the army, reinforcing the idea that this struggle was not just about tribute or territory, but about dignity, faith, and the future of an entire people. Then came the march itself, long, dusty, and exhausting. Late summer roads turned under thousands of boots and hooves. Supplies had to be stretched. Discipline had to hold. Every mile south increased the risk, because Dmitry was moving away from the safety of his own center of power and toward an enemy famous for speed and battlefield flexibility. This was not a cautious campaign. It was a deliberate movement toward a winner-take-all confrontation. Scouts rode ahead, searching for signs of Mamai's position, while tension traveled through the ranks. The men knew they were not marching to intimidate or posture. They were marching toward a battle that would likely decide everything. When word finally came that Mamai's army was encamped near Kulikovo field by the Don River, the decision became immediate and irreversible. Dmitry now stood before a stark strategic choice. He could remain on the safer side of the river and wait, preserving a line of retreat, or he could cross the Don and commit completely to battle. He chose to cross. That choice matters because it tells you exactly what kind of leader he had become. Once the river was behind his army, there would be no easy withdrawal, no graceful fallback, no second chance. The campaign had now turned into a test of nerve as much as arms. Dmitry was gambling everything, his army, his authority, and the future of Moscow, on one brutal truth. If the Russian lands were ever going to stop living in fear, someone had to make this a point of no return. After crossing the Don, Dmitry Ivanovich made the kind of decision that instantly changes the psychological meaning of a battle. He ordered the bridges destroyed. In practical terms, it prevented confusion in retreat and forced discipline. But symbolically, it did something even more powerful. It told every man in his army that there would be no easy way back. No fallback position. No comforting illusion that they could test the enemy and withdraw if things went badly. The river now lay behind them like a closed door. Ahead stretched the open ground of Kulikovo, where the army of Mamai waited. In one command, Dmitry turned the coming fight into a contest of commitment. His men were no longer marching toward battle. They were already inside its logic. The field itself mattered. Kulikovo was not a flat, featureless plain in the simple way later imagination sometimes presents it. There were folds in the land, patches of brush and woodland, shallow depressions, and enough variation to reward a commander who could think beyond brute force. Dmitry understood that he could not beat the Mongols by trying to outmaneuver them in open cavalry warfare. That was their strength. Their speed, discipline, and ability to strike in waves had humbled armies for generations. So he prepared to fight a different battle. He formed his main line as a dense defensive center, built to absorb impact rather than chase glory. Infantry and dismounted cavalry stood together in depth, creating a formation that could take punishment without immediately collapsing. The goal was not elegance. It was endurance. On the flanks he positioned more mobile forces, knowing they would be tested first and hardest once the Mongol attacks began to probe for weakness. Behind the center he held reserves, a recognition that no battle line survives contact with the enemy exactly as planned. But the most important element of all was the force he concealed in the wooded area off to the side. This hidden cavalry reserve, placed under Prince Vladimir of Serpukhov and held back from the opening clash, would become the hinge on which the entire battle might turn. It was a patient weapon, not meant for early heroics. Its purpose was to remain invisible, to wait while the main army suffered, and to strike only when the enemy had committed too deeply to reverse course. That required nerve from both commander and troops. Nothing is harder in battle than waiting while others bleed. As evening settled over the field, the emotional temperature of the army changed. The busy motion of marching gave way to stillness, and stillness gave way to dread. Men checked straps, sharpened blades, adjusted shields, and sat with thoughts they would never say aloud. Some prayed. Some stared into low-burning fires. Some remembered homes they might never see again. Across the darkness, the sounds of the Mongol camp carried through the night. Drums, movement, the distant presence of an army whose reputation had haunted generations. For many in Dmitry's ranks, this was more than fear of death. It was fear of proving that the old stories were true, that the Horde really was unbeatable in open battle, that courage would end in annihilation. Dmitry moved among his men in those hours before dawn, steadying commanders, reinforcing the plan, making himself visible. That mattered. Armies on the edge of battle do not only follow orders, they read emotion. If the prince looked uncertain, uncertainty would spread. If he looked resolved, men could borrow strength from that. And when morning finally came, it arrived cold, gray, and heavy with mist. The sun did not burst dramatically over the horizon. It revealed the battlefield slowly, as if history itself were taking a breath. Across the field, Mamai's banners rose into view. Lines of cavalry formed. Weapons caught the weak light. And in that suspended moment, before the first charge, everything Dmitry had built, his strategy, his gamble, his faith in his army, stood waiting for proof. As the morning mist lifted over Kulikovo field, the long tension of the night gave way to something far more brutal and immediate. Across the open ground, the army of Mamai formed with the calm confidence of a force that had spent generations teaching others what fear felt like. Their banners moved in the wind, their horses shifted beneath them, and their lines stretched with the kind of disciplined menace that could shake an army before the first blow was struck. On the Russian side, the men held position in silence, knowing that once this began, there would be no pause, no reset, and no way to step outside the storm. Everything that had been building, years of tribute, resentment, ambition, prayer, and defiance, was about to collapse into a single day of violence. The battle opened with a moment that later memory would preserve almost like a legend. A Mongol champion rode forward first, massive in armor and mounted with the confidence of a man representing an empire's reputation. From the Russian line came Peresvat, remembered as a warrior monk, though in that instant he was simply a man riding toward death in full view of two waiting armies. They lowered their lances and charged. The distance between them disappeared in seconds. When they collided, both men were struck so hard that both were killed. There was no cleverness in it, no tactical gain, just a pure and terrible symbol of what the day would demand. Before thousands had even entered the fight, Kulikovo had already made its first statement. Nobody was leaving untouched. Then the Mongol assault came in earnest. It did not crash forward as a wild mob. It moved with terrifying discipline. Horse archers advanced, released volleys, wheeled away, and returned again, their arrows climbing into the gray sky before dropping onto the Russian formations like steel rain. The purpose was to unmake the enemy before the heavier impact ever arrived. Men raised shields. Arrows struck wood, leather, iron, and flesh. Horses screamed. The front of the Russian line trembled under the pressure, but it did not split. That mattered more than it might seem. The Mongols had won battles for generations by turning the opening minutes into panic, by forcing opponents to lose order before real contact even began. Dmitri's army, packed deeply and braced for punishment, absorbed the first storm. What followed was the transformation from battle plan to human survival. Cavalry charges slammed into the Russian center and flanks with bone-shaking force. Lances hit shields. Horses crashed into spear walls. Men were knocked backward, trampled, crushed, or pulled into close combat where formation meant less and raw endurance meant everything. The noise must have been overwhelming, not a single unified roar but layers of violence colliding at once. The pounding of hooves, the hiss of arrows, the crack of splintering shafts, the clang of metal, and the raw animal sounds of fear and pain. Dust rose from the field and mixed with smoke and breath until vision itself became uncertain. Orders blurred. Standards mattered because they were often the only things still visible. The Mongols were doing what they had always done best. They attacked in waves, probing, withdrawing, circling, and striking again, never allowing the Russians to settle into comfort. Their cavalry pressed the flanks, searching for weakness, testing whether any section of the line would lose nerve and begin to fold. Against a less disciplined opponent, this kind of pressure might have been enough to shatter the army outright. But Dmitri had not come to Kulikovo hoping for beauty. He had built his line for endurance. The Russian center was dense and stubborn, not graceful but hard to break. Men fought shoulder to shoulder, and when those in front went down, others stepped into the gap because there was no space in which fear could become flight. In the middle of this, Dmitri himself fought in the front ranks. That choice mattered at a level modern audiences instantly understand, because leadership in crisis is never just about commands, it is about visible commitment. He did not ask his men to absorb risks he would not share. Whether by strategy, conviction, or sheer necessity, he placed his body inside the same violence consuming everyone else. He reportedly wore less distinctive armor so he would not immediately draw attention as the prince, but the men around him knew enough. They saw him there, and that presence helped anchor morale in the worst moments. It also exposed him to the same chaos that could swallow any soldier on the field. Hours passed this way, and the battle became a grinding contest no longer defined by elegant maneuver but by attrition. The Mongols pressed hardest against the Russian left, where the ground gave them a little more room to exploit momentum. Gradually, that side of Dmitri's army began to buckle. First it bent, then it slipped, then sections started giving way under the accumulated force of repeated assaults. Men who had held for hours were running out of strength. Horses were blown. Cohesion was thinning. From Mamai's perspective, the pattern looked familiar. One more concentrated push, one decisive exploitation of the weak point, and the entire Russian formation could unravel from the side inward. So Mamai committed harder. He threw more weight into the breakthrough, pushing cavalry through the failing left with the confidence of a commander who believed victory was finally opening in front of him. For a few terrible minutes, It seemed he was right. The Russian left gave way. Mongol riders poured through the breach and began turning toward the center, threatening to strike Dmitri's army from the side and rear. That kind of moment can kill an army faster psychologically than physically. Once soldiers believe the line is gone, collapse can spread like fire. Panic rippled through the Russians. Units lost contact. Dust and confusion magnified the sense that everything was ending at once. Somewhere in that catastrophe, Dmitri was struck down and disappeared into the crush. To the men near him, it may have looked as if the prince had been killed. And that detail matters, because this was the exact point at which battles are decided not only by steel, but by belief. If the prince was dead, if the left was gone, if the Mongols were already wheeling into the center, then the old story of Mongol inevitability would be confirmed all over again. Kulikovo would become another lesson in why resistance was futile. But Mamai's moment of apparent success contained the seed of disaster. In driving aggressively through the breach, his forces stretched themselves forward and sideways at once. Momentum carried them deep, but depth without cohesion is dangerous. Units became separated. Rear elements lagged. Communication frayed. The pursuit disordered the very formations that had created the breakthrough. And hidden in the wooded area, exactly where Dmitri had placed them for this single possibility, Prince Vladimir's reserved cavalry had been waiting. When Vladimir finally gave the signal, the hidden force burst out of concealment and struck the Mongol flank and rear with the kind of force that changes not just battlefield geometry, but battlefield emotion. These were fresh troops hitting men already committed, extended, and no longer expecting a new enemy from that direction. The impact was immediate. Mongol riders who had been attacking suddenly found themselves attacked. Messengers were cut down. Archers and supporting elements were disrupted. Supply wagons and rear positions fell into confusion. The sense of control that had carried the Mongol assault began to disintegrate. This was the real turning point, and it was devastating because it happened first in the mind. For generations, the Mongols had been the side that imposed shock. Now they were experiencing it. Russian soldiers in the battered center saw the enemy falter. Men who minutes earlier had been bracing for annihilation suddenly realized the impossible was happening in front of them. The horde was losing shape. It was recoiling. Panic works both ways, and once it crossed the field, the energy of the battle changed completely. The Russian center, bloodied but still intact, surged forward. What had been a defense became a counterattack. What had been a near collapse became a violent recovery powered by fury, relief, and survival instinct. Mamai watched his army come apart and understood that the field was lost. Once cavalry formations lose cohesion under pressure, especially in a battle this large and chaotic, recovery becomes brutally difficult. Units flee not because every man has chosen cowardice, but because organized resistance dissolves faster than commanders can restore it. The Mongol army began to break into fragments, then into retreat. Mamai himself abandoned the field and rode south, leaving behind the wounded, the dead, and the shattered remains of the confidence he had brought north. The route that followed was not glorious in the romantic sense. It was violent, desperate, and ugly. Russian horsemen pursued fleeing units across the steppe, cutting down stragglers and seizing banners and wagons. All across Kulikovo field lay the proof of what the day had cost. The ground was covered with bodies, broken weapons, wounded animals, torn standards, and men calling for water or mercy. The Russians had won, but not neatly and not cheaply. Their victory had been purchased at the edge of collapse, with enormous losses and no certainty until the final reversal. That is what gives the climax of Kulikovo its lasting power. This was not a triumph delivered by convenience. It was a victory earned through endurance, timing, sacrifice, and the ability to hold one more minute than fear thought possible. The Russians did not discover that day that war was glorious. They discovered something more dangerous and more important, that the enemy they had been taught to fear for generations could, under the right conditions, be beaten. And once a people learn that, history is never quite the same again. When the fighting finally ended and the noise of battle gave way to the cries of the wounded, Dmitri was found alive, battered, unconscious, and buried beneath the wreckage of the field he had risked everything to hold. Around him lay the true price of Kulikovo. Thousands were dead. Noble families had been shattered. Entire communities would feel the loss for years. This was not a clean victory, and it was not the end of the Golden Horde's power. Tribute would return. Mongol influence would survive. History, as it often does, refused to change in a single dramatic instant. And yet something real had happened on that field by the dawn. Mamai's army had been broken, his authority shattered, and before long he would fall from power altogether. Dmitri and his surviving men began the long road back to Moscow, carrying their wounded, mourning their dead, and trying to understand what they had just done. They had stood in open battle against the force that had dominated the Russian lands for generations, and they had not been destroyed. That fact alone changed the political imagination of the age. Dmitri would be remembered as Dmitri Donskoy, the Prince of the Don, a name earned not simply through victory, but through the willingness to cross the river with no promise of return. Kulikovo did not instantly free Russia, but it gave the Russian lands something just as important in that moment. Proof. Proof that the Horde could be resisted. Proof that fear was not destiny. Proof that a people divided for generations could still stand together when history demanded it. If you enjoy stories where battles are more than battles, where leadership, risk, sacrifice, and turning points shape the future, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to keep exploring the moments that changed civilizations, stay with us for the next chapter.